It's 4 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and call to order this meeting of the Salina Heritage Commission. I'd like to request that staff confirm that the Kansas Open Meeting Act require notice has been properly provided.
I can confirm that the packet was posted and the required notice of the meeting was provided.
Thank you. Let's go next to roll call.
I will call roll. Commissioner Gilmore,
Present.
Commissioner Seibel,
Here.
Commissioner Driscoll, Commissioner Baffa,
Here.
Commissioner Martin,
Present.
Mr. Mike Sell,
Present.
Chair Gillum.
Here.
So that gives us a quorum of 6 of our 7 appointed members, and that would give us the jurisdiction to move forward and conduct today's business. And so we'll turn it back to the chair for review of the minutes.
Okay, thanks, Dean. Item 2.1 is the approval of the minutes from the February 10th, 2022 special meeting. Those meeting notes were included in your packet, so hopefully you've all had a chance to look those over and review those. I'll give you just another minute to review them, and if there's any discussion or questions.
I move we accept.
I
have a
second.
I have a motion to approve the minutes and a second. All those in favor? Aye. Opposed? Approval of the minutes passes. We'll move on to new business. It doesn't appear that we have any public hearing items today, but we do have one administrative item, item 3.1, the overview of the Kansas Certified Local Government Program, State Preservation Law and Historic Preservation and Heritage Trust Grant Programs by Katrina Ringler, Preservation Office Supervisor, State Historic Preservation Office.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At this time, I would turn it over to Katrina Ringler, and she's got a presentation that she would like to make, and then have some dialogue with the commission, and building on some dialogue that she had with staff prior to this meeting.
Good evening. How are you all? As you heard, my name is Katrina Ringler. I am the Preservation Office Supervisor and also the CLG Coordinator for the state of Kansas. I work at the Kansas Historical Society in the State Historic Preservation Office. So every 4 years, I'm tasked with going to each of the CLGs, and I kind of rotate them because we have 18 in the state of Kansas, to do an evaluation. And so I meet with staff and kind of talk over what are the sort of minimum criteria that a CLG, a certified local government, has to meet in order to maintain their certification. So we talked, Dustin and Dean and I, about through the checklist, kind of working down and saying, okay, do we have this? Yes, we do that, clarifying a couple things. And I always like to then attend a meeting, kind of make sure you guys are following Robert's Rules of Order and all of that good stuff, but also to tell you a little bit about some of the things we talked about and give you a refresher on sort of where you fit in the state and national bigger picture as far as preservation goes. So if you would, Dustin. So the CLG program was established with the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, along with a lot of other things that form our national preservation policy and sort of the community that we have now. So the National Register of Historic Places was formed in 1966. The State Historic Preservation Offices, which we lovingly call SHPOs, but at that time also the groundwork, sort of the framework of certified local governments was also formed. Certified local government, or CLG, just means it's a partnership between local governments, cities and counties, also can be things like parishes and villages in other states. The State Historic Preservation Office, me in the middle, and the National Park Service at the federal level. Okay, go ahead. So a CLG is a local government. It has to be a governmental unit certified by the Park Service because they have at minimum these things. They have a local preservation ordinance that enforces state or local legislation for designating and protecting historic properties. So you guys do have that. You have a local landmark program. It establishes the local preservation commission, which obviously, that's why you're here tonight, right? It maintains a system for survey and inventory. And that's one of the things that I will recommend in my evaluation reply letter, is that Salina work toward more survey and inventory. It's really hard to preserve historic resources if we don't know where they are. And my understanding is that there was a lot of survey and inventory work done in the 80s and 90s and not much since then. And if you think about that, in the 80s and 90s, if they were looking at properties that were about 50 years old or more, that cuts off your historic resources about like the 1930s. So all through the middle of the 20th century, 50 years ago is now 1972, believe it or not. So this building that we're standing in is eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. It's very hard to know what might be missing out there as far as properties that may be demolished, may need protection, if we don't know where they are or what their status is. So survey and inventory is a great way to find that out, and it's also a good planning tool for the planning department. You're also required to provide adequate public participation in the local program, which you do, and satisfactorily perform responsibilities of the program, which is sort of one of those, other duties as assigned type things. Go ahead. I'm not going to make you read all this, but I want to highlight a couple of points. This is the actual document that says what all you're supposed to do. The state preservation law 74-2724 is something we will talk about a little bit today. I do think it is a common misconception that my office, when we talk about the state preservation law, it gets confused with certified local government, because half of the certified local governments in Kansas have an agreement with my office to do state law reviews at the local level. Salina is one of those 8 or 9 that have that agreement. You can be a CLG without doing design review. You cannot do design review without being a CLG in Kansas. So that's something that, as I talk through this, maybe I'll try to extrapolate a little bit more, but I want to make sure that that's clear. That's a common misconception. So we talked about most of these things. You have to have public hearings. You have to be open to the public. You have to have enforceable decisions and rights of appeal with your local landmarks decisions, which you guys have. Go ahead. Members of the commission, there have to be a minimum of 5 members, and about 40% of those have to be what we call professional, members in some way, shape, or form. Dean was explaining to me that your guys' bylaws actually establish certain members of the commission, like there has to be a historian or an architect or an attorney or whatever. I wanted to explain that those are things that are in your guys' bylaws, not necessarily something that the CLG requires. So if it ever becomes a issue where you're having trouble filling certain positions, like you just can't find an architect or an attorney, you might look at changing the bylaws to make them a little bit more open or flexible, because as far as the certified local government program is concerned, we just need to have about 40% of the members, which I think would be like, 3 out of 7, be some kind of preservation-related professional, and that's very wide open. It could be a genealogist or a history teacher at the high school, or lots of different things. We do ask that you meet a minimum of no less than 2 times a year, and we do ask for an annual report, which I'm going to be working with Dean and Dustin on. I understand you guys do an annual report on a calendar year for the City Commission. The National Park Service wants slightly different information, as usual. My executive director always wants slightly different information than we usually report for other things. This never makes it easy, but we'll get with you guys on that, because we do want to know how many properties you are designating to the register, how many design review cases you guys are doing, how many properties are being added to the inventory and being surveyed. Go ahead. When we do talk about survey, that is a big component of the preservation sort of the process. My office and the National Park Service, when we talk about preservation programs, we always talk about identification is the first step. and then designation, and then protection. And so the identification piece is critical. And so I'm going to stress that a lot, that I do have some funds available to help with that. That's for CLGs in general. I want to emphasize that we need to do more to identify where the historic resources are. But when those are identified, we would very much like them to be inserted into our online database. That way it's available and open to the public. That also helps us when people call us and say, hey, I want to fix up my house, or I have a downtown commercial building I want, to do a rehabilitation. We can quickly look up in our database and say, oh, I see it was built in 1918 and it has this kind of roof and it has all of these different features, and I can give them better information that way. Otherwise, I'm relying on Google Street View, and that's not always reliable. Go ahead. Oh, you can go ahead, sorry. And then this is the other one, duties as assigned. Basically, anything else you are allowed to do as a certified local government, as long as it's in your preservation ordinance, which is your local law, as long as it says you can. And most of the local preservation ordinances say that you can do things like advocate for preservation, educate. So if there are community activities, events in town, May is National Preservation Month, so if there was an activity or something that you as the commission thought, hey, this would be a great opportunity for us to get out and educate the public, usually your preservation commission, your preservation ordinance will allow you to do that. That is something that we support, and we're happy to help you if you need ideas or anything like that. Go ahead. So one of my main messages when I train preservation commissions is to let you know that you have the power. At the national level in the preservation world, it is a misconception that the federal government and the state government have really much power to do much. We have money. We have the framework of how to help you guys do preservation work. But as you'll see on the next couple slides, you are the ones who have the enforcement power. The federal and state preservation laws, they don't have a lot of teeth. I know they can be very scary. A lot of times people have, oh, if I list my building on the National Register, someone's going to come and tell me what I can and can't do. It won't be the feds or the state that will do that. It would be the local government and the local preservation commission that does that, if that's even a thing. Because we don't have the mechanism to make property owners or to keep property owners from doing things to their property. Go ahead with the next one. So at the local level, you all are established by the same state statute that creates the planning and zoning commissions. The state legislation that says cities and counties can have planning and zoning also says that they can have preservation commissions. So it's very encouraging to me that we're meeting in this room, that you guys are on the platform with your names. Not all plant preservation commissions are treated that way. Sometimes they are in the back room of the library and they meet in very sort of, back room situations. It's technically open to the public, but it's not being, broadcast on the web or on TV. So I want to make sure that you guys kind of feel that when you're doing your meetings, because you are at the same level as far as an advisory committee to the city council. But at the local government level, the city has the ability to pass ordinances, to enforce codes, to conduct planning, to enforce zoning, enforce minimum maintenance requirements, and of course impose fines. And so that is where the protection power comes in the preservation world. We don't really have any of those enforcement authorities at the state or federal level. So we want to facilitate and help you all make sure that the resources in your community that are important to you are protected through the mechanisms that you have. Go ahead. So the local preservation commission and your staff are the conduit between the public and the local government. You guys are here as the advisory committee. You're all volunteers. I'm assuming nobody forced you to be here, right? So you guys are that body that then, carries out the decision-making process for certain things, and then advise the city council, of course. You carry out the local preservation ordinance, you promote preservation education, you can do identification process, and of course, you are the ones that we bring nominations to when it's time to designate a local landmark or significant resource. And you guys have a couple of different, I understand, different levels of designation. There's like tell me if I'm wrong, Dean, a conservation or a heritage conservation sort of thing that's related to the early surveys, right?
Yeah, historic conservation properties where their only protection is from demolition. There's no regulation of additions or modifications, but they're protected from being demolished without review by the Heritage Commission.
And those do come to the Heritage Commission for review, right?
Yes.
Okay, that's really cool. That's something that's not common with other preservation programs at the local level. And then you also have landmark designations, which are more of a sort of a landmarking designation where you have individual properties or historic district. As we move on to the next slide, the State Historic Preservation Office, we administer several programs at the state and national level, such as the National and State Register of Historic Places. We also have tax credit programs, a Heritage Trust Fund grant, federal and state preservation laws that we conduct reviews under, and then the Historic Preservation Fund grant. And I'm going to pause for a second because I forgot to do some handouts for you guys. I'm just going to hand you, you can take one of each of these, and then if you want to put your name and your email address on here, I can send you the presentation and these handouts afterwards by email if you'd like. One of those handouts has a little blurb in there about what a CLG is, and then we also have information about the tax credit program, the Heritage Trust Fund, and then I have a little comparison in there as well about local review, design review versus state level review, which is what we are going to go to next. So you may have mentioned or noticed that both local preservation programs and the state and national program, we conduct design review of some kind. So at the state level, my office, we do design review daily for tax credit applications, grant reviews, state and federal preservation law reviews. And of course, you guys are doing design review whenever a case is brought before you, either for a demolition permit or a building permit, or whatever needs to be reviewed under your local ordinance. And so we are looking at the existing conditions and then applying the Secretary of the Interior standards, which we'll get to in a little bit, to the proposal to decide if this is going to meet the standards. And different laws have different thresholds for how a project either does or doesn't meet the standards. So one of the things I was explaining to the staff earlier is that a certificate of appropriateness, or a COA, is a common word or language that's used for design review at the local level. It's critical to understand that a COA is only associated with your local ordinance. It is only applicable to properties that are listed on your local landmarks list. A COA is not the same as a state law review on a property that's on a state or national register. That is a state law review. That is a state statute that we have given, we've kind of delegated our authority at the state level for you guys to do the review on our behalf. And so the state law says, will this project damage or destroy a historic property? Use the standards to determine that. So damage or destroy is the threshold that we look at for state law. Your local ordinance may have a much stricter threshold for reviewing projects on your local landmark list. And that's okay, because they are two separate legal mechanisms. They should have two separate motions and two separate votes. So if a case comes before you, and the staff can help with this, if a case comes before you that is a local landmark and a National Register historic site, then it would maybe require a COA and a state law review, and those should be separate. You can look at the case as one case, you can hear the proposal one time, but there should be two separate motions and two separate votes. Okay, go ahead. Feel free to ask questions if you guys have any as we go along.
I guess I would just pause to interject what we didn't do correctly. So the most recent case that we had involved the installation of an electronic changeable copy sign at the Stiefel Theater, which is on the National Register of Historic Places. And so when we did that review and we did the staff report, we applied the Secretary of Interior standards because it's a National Register property. But when we got to the end of the item, staff didn't separate out this local certificate of appropriateness aspect from the state law review. So you made a single motion and you approved a certificate of appropriateness for the sign. And so we did not clearly indicate that you needed to make two motions, one dealing that you found it conformed with state law, and then separately that you found it conformed to get a certificate of appropriateness. So that's something that we had not done, but that's an example where this commission was reviewing that on behalf of the State Preservation Office. In some communities, there wouldn't be a local review of that. The Stiefel Theater's request would have gone directly to the state office.
Yeah. We review about 3,000 of those a year. Those are just state reviews. We also review about 1,000 federal reviews, so it keeps us busy. So we very much appreciate you all doing Salinas. You guys can keep doing that. I'll get to that in a little bit too. So this is just a little bit more clarity, and of course I told you your handout has one of those pages has like blue and red comparisons side by side. The state law is a statute 75-2724 that says the state and all subdivisions of the state where they are undertaking a project, funding a project, or permitting a project on a listed historic property, which means state or national listed, must be reviewed by my office or a community that has an agreement with us. So state law is always going to only apply to state and national register listed properties. Also historic districts that are state and the National Register listed. Within those historic districts, it's the contributing and non-contributing properties, and it's all the things in between, as well as the interiors, because it is the action by the government, meaning the permit, or it may be a grant, or it may be an undertaking. Like I went downtown earlier today, and I saw you guys are doing lots of streetscape work downtown. If that was a downtown historic district, then that would have needed to be reviewed by the Landmarks Commission. So not to say that that was a bad thing or anything like that, just it would need to be reviewed as part of the process. So it's always.
Grandfathered, no.
I'm sorry?
It's grandfathered, though, no?
If downtown was to become a National Historic District, yes, those would be non-contributing resources. And so in 20 years, if that was going to be redone with something new, at that time, then there would need to be a review, assuming the state law was still around. So the state law is always triggered by an action of the government. So the city government, the county government, or the state government, or a school board. The local law, your local preservation ordinance, should only apply to local landmarks. Now, some properties may be a local landmark and a state or national register property, like we said before, and like Dean was explaining, in those cases, you need to separate out the reviews. But if you have, just a house or a little building that's on the local landmark register by itself, and they need to do something that triggers a review, that COA, then that is where the review comes in under your local ordinance. It's triggered by whatever's outlined in your ordinance. Many communities, it's triggered by a permit or something. But sometimes the language in the ordinance just says, property owners shall obtain a COA. And, as a property owner, I'm not always sure that I would know what requires a permit or what requires a COA. So that is something to kind of review on a cyclical basis, is look at your ordinance, read through it, does it make sense? We talked about earlier what would be the penalty for not getting a COA. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but apparently in Salina, it's part of like code enforcement. So it would just be like someone not getting a permit. It would be susceptible to the same kind of permitting enforcement. Okay, go ahead. So I mentioned earlier the Secretary of the Interior standards. I printed out a copy of those for you guys, just the 10 standards by themselves. These are, the Secretary of the Interior is the Department of the Interior at the federal level. They oversee the National Park Service. So one of the branches of the Park Service is the Technical Preservation Services branch. It's a mouthful. There are actually 4 sets of standards: preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, and reconstruction. Unless you are reconstructing a historic property, which almost nobody does, or you are preserving it exactly the way it is, you're not changing anything, or you're restoring it like a museum or some sort of tourism historic site, 99.9% of everything that you or I do as far as design review is going to be rehabilitation, because we are not looking to make people live in a historic house with a wood-burning stove and an outhouse. We're not trying to make business owners in a commercial building work with gas lights and, coal-burning stoves or that kind of thing. So we're trying to preserve the historic features of the property, but still allow changes for new use, adaptive reuse, and of course, continual modern uses. And so that's what the standards strive to do. There are on the National Park Service website, if you go to that link, lots of other tabs at the top of that page where you can explore how to interpret the standards, guidelines to the standards, preservation briefs, all kinds of additional guidance, because admittedly the standards are pretty vague. They're just 10 statements that have to apply to every type of historic property. So everything from a train to a ship to a bridge, and then all of the buildings in between those. So they tend to be pretty vague, and they're open to interpretation, but that's why we need folks like you, folks at my office, to interpret those standards and apply them to the different properties. Go ahead. I mentioned consequences. So at the local level, you guys, like I said, have enforcement of your local permitting requirements. That may be a fine. Some communities have jail time if you fail to get a permit or fail to get a COA. At the state law level, we do have a $25,000 fine, but it says in the statute it is for property owners who intentionally circumvent the permit process in order to avoid review. And we've never had one time that that's been imposed, I think because it would be very hard to get that proven in court. But it does provide a bit of an incentive. It creates a little bit of a talking point when you're talking to property owners about, yeah, they need to get their permits and make sure that they're doing the state law process. Go ahead. So Historic Preservation Fund grants, the CLGs are given, oh, that was flipped to the next one. I think I left that one there by accident. Thank you. The Historic Preservation Fund grant is a grant that, on one of my many hats that I wear as the Preservation Office Supervisor, I'm also the grants manager. This is federal money that comes to us from the National Park Service. It is actually federal money that comes from Outer Continental Shelf oil lease revenues. It is not tax money. It's passed through the National Park Service to the state historic preservation offices to basically run our offices. It pays for some of our salaries and overhead. 10% of that at minimum we are supposed to pass through to the CLGs in our state. So every year we have an annual grant round. Applications are due in March. We just finished this year's application round. But some years, like this year, we are a little short on our 10%. And so we will probably be putting out another call to see if there are CLGs with additional ideas for projects. You can also contact me at any time during the year to just see if I have additional money, because sometimes we get money turned back, or we give out all of our money to the CLGs and then some. We usually have more than 10% to award, and then we still have some that we need to spend. So if there is a project in the works, if you have an idea, we're going to talk through a couple of ideas here. Feel free to reach out to me and say, hey, is this a valid project? Would this work? Could we apply for this kind of funding for this? And then I would just need a proposal and a budget. So it's pretty simple and easy. There's not a lot of competition. There's only 18 CLGs in the state. Other nonprofits, local governments, and universities are also eligible to apply, but the CLGs get the priority consideration because we have to fund you guys first. Go ahead. So things that you can do with CLG money. Intensive surveys, number one, because we've been talking about that. That is a critical for sort of ground, grassroots type thing that we all have to do, is find the historic resources first and figure out where they are. I wanted to point out it's not just buildings, it can also be archaeological sites. Manhattan did that a few years ago. They did an archaeological survey around Wildcat Creek in areas that they knew were going to have heavy development pressure. And they wanted to make sure that they knew where those resources were so that they could direct developers away from those areas. National Register nominations. So if the downtown or a residential neighborhood, even a group, like let's say there were several churches in town that wanted to list their buildings on the National Register, the city could apply for a grant to me to hire a consultant to write those nominations. Preservation plans. Dean was explaining that you guys do have a city preservation plan, but it's from the 90s. Might be time for an update. That would help you guys know what are work list items to kind of start chipping away at. Having a preservation plan as a first step may be an idea, because then you could establish how you want to conduct survey over the course of the next several years. Educational programming for students. We've had a couple of different programs CLGs do. The most recent one I have as an example is in Newton. It's their 150th anniversary this year, and they wanted to do a program for grade school students, and they wanted to partner with their local library, and so they got together and came up with a curriculum for a week-long sort of a summer school program. And the first day, they're taking the kids downtown and they're doing a walking tour and having them look at the buildings and talk about the history of different buildings. The second day, they're having somebody from the railroad come in and talk about the railroad history in Newton. The third day, they're having a historian or a genealogist come in and talk about, something to do with immigration or something into Newton. And then by the end of the week, the class is doing sort of an art project, what did you learn, and create a mural or something about what you learned about Newton history. So that's just an example of the kind of things that we can fund. We've also funded actual curriculum for a school based on a cemetery in Lawrence. They were trying to find new uses for the city cemetery and doing preservation work there. And they wanted to make sure that younger people were, brought up to speed on how important cemeteries were to doing historical research. And so they have several, curriculum, study plans, lesson plans that you can look at. Other kinds of conferences and trainings. So not only can we send you guys to conferences and trainings, but we can also fund bringing people to Salina. So if it was something that you were seeing lots of homeowners that were needing help repairing their wood windows, and maybe you wanted to bring a speaker to town to put on a workshop, a hands-on demonstration or something like that. We've funded many of those. We funded a similar workshop in Topeka where a consultant came to show people how to take a vinyl siding off of a house to reveal the historic siding underneath. We can do trainings for not only commissioners and staff, but also the public. So just keeping that in mind. Many of our CLGs have done recent brochure updates and brought those into more of the mobile app arena. So maybe you used to have an old driving brochure or walking tour brochure that's down at the Chamber of Commerce or something, making those into a story map that's online or an app that people can use on their phone. Design guidelines is another thing. I know that talking with Dean, that there is a set of design guidelines for the downtown. What do we call this? Heritage, it's an overlay district or something, conservation district?
It's our Salina Business Improvement District.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a preservation district, but there's a design guideline for those properties. You could do something similar, design review guidelines for other historic districts or even conservation overlay districts, if that was helpful to the property owners and to you guys as the design reviewers. And then I always plug planning for disasters. Newton also did this recently where they did a comprehensive disaster plan for their historic properties that became part of their overall disaster plan. They worked with their emergency management team and also all the other players in town as far as law enforcement, fire, code officials. And it's something that a lot of towns don't think about until it's too late. If you guys have a flood, a tornado, a fire that's catastrophic, number one, having a survey in place is really good. That was one of the first things that Greensburg did after the tornado was they called us to find out if we had photographs of what their downtown used to look like. We did not. FEMA is going to ask for that. That's one of the first things they're going to ask for because as a federal agency, they are required to identify historic properties before they start doing work. If you know where your historic properties are and can just hand them the survey, it makes the FEMA process go a lot faster. So survey would be number one, and some sort of component to your disaster plan that incorporates historic preservation would be another thing that we could fund. Go ahead. Just a couple other things that CLGs are doing right now. There is a lot of survey going on for mid-century modern resources. Manhattan is undertaking a mid-century modern survey right now. Topeka just finished one for commercial properties, and they're probably going to be looking at a residential resources survey soon. Topeka this year applied for a multiple property nomination for African American resources for Topeka. I put an asterisk next to mini grants because there's a couple different ways you could do that. You can apply to us for a pool of money and then take that pool of money and sub-grant it to property owners in a couple of different ways. You could give them direct funding, or you could use the money to hire like an architect or an engineer that then is on call for when a property owner needs help. The city of Hutchinson did that a few years ago. They basically put an architect on retainer, and when property owners came to them and said, you know, I want to rehab my porch, but I don't know how I should make it look. Like, I don't know how to draw this up. Welcome to our architect. He will give you 5 hours of free service, and the city will pay for it. So our grants can pay for things like that. Lots of National Register nominations, educational programming, like I said, walking tours, and then a lot of our CLGs are actually updating older National Register nominations because the older nominations don't have a lot of detail. They kind of were very slim. Go ahead. Sorry, I'm fighting allergies. Just a couple examples. The city of Olathe has a preservation plan from 2013. It's very comprehensive. Example in the top left of just, you know, a training or a conference. And then archaeological resources that sometimes we don't really think about, but there are archaeological resources in our community that probably have not been identified. Okay. A couple of things that I'm just going to plug in case you have an interest or staff has an interest in attending these. The National Main Street Program is sort of a partner with the Park Service, and so we can send Main Street staff, Main Street Board, as well as the Preservation Commission and staff to Main Street conferences and trainings. And then go ahead. And then the big thing that I always plug for preservation commissioners and staff is to attend the biannual National Alliance of Preservation Commissions Forum, which is a conference. So every other year, they have this conference. The year before last, it was a virtual conference, obviously. But this year, it's going to be in Cincinnati. And we do have funding to help with registration, travel, lodging, and I was trying to think, registration, lodging, and travel. That's basically it. Everything except for food. I can't pay for food for anything. So if you do have an event and you want to provide food, that's going to be on your own. You have to get a sponsor or ask the participants to pay for it. But otherwise, I can pay for pretty much anything that's going to educate or facilitate preservation programs. Lastly, my contact there on the left, Lauren Jones is one of my staff members. She specifically deals with review and compliance, which is the law. So the state and federal law reviews. If you have a question about state law and your state law agreement, she can definitely help you with that. Local review and your local ordinance probably is more in my realm. I will point out, and I think Dean included it in your packets, your agreement with the SHPO to do state level reviews expires next month. It was a surprise to me. When I was looking at your guys' files, I was like, oh, good timing, okay. No worries, no big hurry, but I will send a template to the staff in the next week or so and say, okay, let's talk to the city council and make sure everybody's still on the same page, that you still want to do those reviews on our behalf and get that re-signed and renewed. There's no reason to stop doing reviews at this time. You guys can keep doing them, but we need to get that updated. And then I'm free for all the questions you have.
Sure seems like City of Salina needs to do a lot of work.
I would say in the realm of survey, I think you guys are more well off in a lot of ways than other CLGs as far as you've got a full board. I'm looking here, Dean says all of the seats are filled. That's amazing. Most of them are not like that. You have those different levels of protection as far as heritage conservation versus landmarking versus your downtown business. That's all great. But we were talking about earlier, the downtown, for example, they have all of the regulations but not the benefits of listing on the National Register. Properties that are listed on the National Register would be eligible for tax credits. And so the buildings downtown that are individually listed, like the theater, and then there's maybe a couple other ones, they've had to do that work on their own to get listed. And it can be very difficult for an individual property to get listed because they have to meet a higher threshold of integrity of materials and design. When we're looking at a downtown historic district, we're really just looking at the facade. And so as long as the facade is good, they could contribute to the district and get in on the tax credits. But without a historic district, they're just sort of out of luck. So that it would be something to work on too.
So there is funds available to survey, hire someone to do the survey?
Yeah. So the Historic Preservation Fund grants, we don't have a strict cap on the grants, but somewhere around 25, 30, 35,000 would be the max. So that would be kind of the budget we would be looking at for a grant. It does require a 40% match, but the match can be in kind. So staff time, staff resources, like having, if there was a mapping, someone that does mapping here at the city, they produce the map for the survey, that's match. you guys talk about the survey at a public meeting, all of your guys' time counts as match. Those kind of things. It's pretty easy. And then we can also waive the match for CLGs because they're the special partners we have in the program. So, but yes, we can fund a preservation consultant to come and just do it. We can train volunteers to help them do it, or we could reimburse and pay staff that's already here at the city if there was a staff person who wanted to take it on as a project and was able to do that.
I have a question, more that stems a little bit from personal experience, working with both SHPO and MPS on several projects here locally and in other places. You said at the beginning of the meeting that, the power kind of lies within the local government, and that MPS and SHPO don't have a lot of say. However, when you're doing tax credit projects,
Tax credit, yes.
they have a lot of say, and they do dictate a lot of what's done. And we've ran into a few issues where we've been in disagreement with, particular things that they want us to do on properties. Is there anything that can be done at the local level to kind of, I guess, combat? Okay.
No, unfortunately, because it's a funding source, that's the kicker. When I say that they don't have a lot of teeth, like the state and federal preservation laws require you to follow a process, but as long as the process plays out, like, for example, at the state level, let's say you guys at the Landmarks Commission say no, that you do not believe this meets the standards. It's a demolition or something like that. The property owner then has the right to appeal to the city council. If the city council finds that there are no prudent and feasible alternatives, the process has been followed, the permit gets issued, the building gets demolished, that's all that can be done, unless someone wants to sue in court saying that the process was not followed, and then it's a matter for the courts. Similar at the federal level, they can go through the process. There's actually a mitigation component at the federal level, where if we say it does not meet the standards, the applicant says, well, I want to do it this way anyway. We say, okay, well, then you have to do something else to basically offset the harm that you're doing to the historic building. We come to an agreement, the project moves on. The Historic Preservation Fund is actually mitigation for the environmental impact that oil drilling does on the ocean. So that's how we get that money. At the tax credit and grant level, there's the money component. If you want the money, you have to follow our rules. And so that's where they're at. If it's the federal tax credit, the Park Service has the final say. If it's the state tax credit, the state has the final say. Yeah. Yeah, so it's our interpretation of it, yeah. Excuse me. Any other questions?
In the case where this body would be making a state review, and if they're not approving a certificate of appropriateness, what is it that they're approving? Are they just making a finding that the proposed work won't damage or destroy the historic property, or is there something that they're granting on behalf of the state?
Nope, that is exactly what they are doing, and that is the language that the motion should say. We find that this project will or will not damage or destroy the Smith House, or whatever the property is. That is the threshold that the state law says we are holding this project to. We're using the Secretary of the Interior standards to determine that, but we're just finding damage or destroy. Now, if you do find that a project will damage or destroy a historic property, you probably should cite what standards you think were not met. So this will damage or destroy this house because standard number, and I'm not going to quote them right because I don't remember right off the top of my head, but standard number 4, let's say, says that you shall preserve historic features, and they're ripping out all the historic features. So this does not meet standard number 4, therefore it will damage the historic property. But yeah, that's the language that should be. Yeah,
You mentioned 50 years. That covers a lot of property.
it does. It does. 1972.
I mean, like, why not put my house on the historic register?
You could. If it meets the criteria. It has to be 50 years old or older. It has to have integrity of design and materials, and it has to meet one of 4 criteria, either historic event, a historic person, an architectural significance, or an archaeological significance. But if you have a building that's 50 years old and still has all of its historic features and materials, it probably has some significance in one of those 4, if not multiples. So we have a preliminary process in our office that anybody can send us information, a couple photographs, information that you know about the property, and we will give you, it's about a 30-day turnaround, but we will give you a feedback that says, yeah, we think this is eligible for listing, or no, we think it's not. If we think it's eligible for listing, then we'll give you sort of more information about how to do the nomination process. And if we say, no, it's probably not eligible, I mean, you're still welcome to submit a nomination and we still will process it. It just may not go anywhere, but yeah.
Could you discuss a little bit more about the Heritage Trust Fund grant? And I think one of the questions that staff and sometimes the Heritage Commission is faced with the most, besides the tax credits, is there any, I want to renovate or rehabilitate this older house. Is there someplace I can go to get financial assistance, or are there grant funds, or are there sources of assistance to help with the renovation project?
So the Heritage Trust Fund, which I know is unfortunately an acronym very similar to the Historic Preservation Fund. Probably it was done by design by somebody that wasn't thinking. But the Heritage Trust Fund, HTF, is a grant that we have. It is a state-funded grant, and it is for property owners. So a owner of a historic property listed in the state or the National Register, I'm going to lose my voice, can apply for the grant in November, and we make awards in February. And those grants are for physical work on a historic building. It's a very competitive grant. We have about $3 to $4 million requested every year, and we give out about $1 million. So a third to a quarter of applicants get funded. That being said, grant or projects that are for the preservation of sort of the exterior envelope of the building are going to have a better chance of getting funded. So roof, walls, windows, doors, foundations are going to be more successful than like a kitchen remodel or something like that. But it is competitive. We do try to spread the money out across the state. They also try to look at counties that have not received much funding in the past. So if Saline County hasn't had many grants in the past, which, I mean, you guys have had a few, but not as much as like Sedgwick County or Johnson County, then, you know, they try to kind of emphasize that as like, okay, well, Saline County hasn't had one in a while. This is a good project. Let's give them that one. It is a hard decision for the grant committee. They're volunteers like you guys, and so they have to look at all these grants and just make a decision. But it is available. It's just that it's a timing issue for a lot of people. They can't wait for November and then, you know, February to find out, and then next spring before they can start work. It's a reimbursement grant, meaning that the property owner has to get approval, submit a scope of work to us, go out to bid for a contractor, pay the contractor at least for a segment of work, and then get reimbursed. And so sometimes property owners don't have the ability to get a loan, or they don't have the cash flow to make that work. And that's unfortunately just the way the program works, so.
I'm sure you're familiar with the St. John's Hospital property.
Yeah.
It seems like that money might be available to remove the newer structures to make it more historic and more viable for the National Register to give it.
It has to be listed on the register before you can apply for the grant. So is it listed yet?
That is, it's probably the,
I don't remember.
this is probably the strangest experience we've had with that program, but it's our understanding that the St. John's, the historic portion of the hospital is on the State Register of Historic Places.
Okay.
The National Register nomination was pending, and the Park Service,
Wanted more information.
well, they wanted to know, they would not consider it until all the non-historic portions were removed.
So yeah, that would be a potential project. I don't know how well it would compete against other projects, but it would be a viable project. It would be eligible. Yeah. Oh, I was going to also plug the Department of Commerce for commercial properties. They tend to have money that comes up every once in a while that they target specific property types. And recently they had a program called HEAL. I'm not going to remember this right. It was like Historic Economic something something. But it was specifically for older commercial properties. And they didn't necessarily have to be listed on the register, but they had to be like 50 years or older, and they had to be a commercial use. And they gave out several emergency grants, and then they did a more long-term, just regular grant round. And so we've been working with them on those to review some of those, because again, those trigger the state law. So we've had to review some of those, but I don't know if that program's going to be renewed in the coming year, but it may be replaced with something else, or there may be some other kind of funding that they come up with that they send out periodically. So I would, especially if it's a commercial property, I would have the property owners reach out to the Department of Commerce, because they have a lot of resources that just kind of come and go.
Would that include churches, schools?
I don't know about that for Department of Commerce. Our stuff does schools, nonprofit organizations, city halls, county courthouses, churches, yeah. Yep. Locomotives, bridges, all kinds of things. Any other questions, guys? All right, well, you have my contact information as well, so if you do have questions later, I will pick up that sign-in sheet, and anybody that provided their email address, I will send you the presentation and stuff later, okay? All right, thank you, guys.
Thank you. Okay, we'll move on. It doesn't look like we have any unfinished or other business listed on our agenda. And public forum, not seeing anybody in the public today to comment, so if no one else has any other discussion or items.
I would just, before we adjourn, I would just note we don't have it scheduled yet, and we would be reaching out to you to figure out time for a special meeting, but we do have a demolition request that's submitted by Salina Regional Health Center for a house that's located at 211 West South Street, and they have submitted a proposal to demolish that house, and it is located in the 8th Street Prescott Highland Historic District, and so that demolition request would come before the Heritage Commission, so we'll be reaching out to you to try to find a time for a special meeting, hopefully on a Wednesday, hopefully at 4 o'clock, but if Margie or someone else contacts you to see if you can attend, then we would schedule that for review. But that's a pending item that we have not scheduled yet.
What's the address again?
211 West South. It's on the south side of South Street between 7th and 8th Street.
Okay, we will watch for that correspondence then regarding that request.
And then I have some information about the national conference in Cincinnati that Katrina sent me, and either Margie or I will forward that on to you so you can look at that and look at the opportunities for scholarships or things if you have any interest in attending. We'll coordinate that with you.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other discussion items?
Yes, I'd like to recognize Alex Driscoll in attendance.
Oh,
And I do apologize. I had this on my calendar for 5 o'clock. I'm not sure how I made that mistake.
well, you just missed us, Alex. We're getting ready to adjourn the meeting, so we'll have to catch it next week's meeting.
But we will be getting a copy of the presentation that was made today, Alex, so we'll get that out to you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, in that case, I would entertain a motion to adjourn today's meeting.
I make that motion.
Second?
I have a motion and a second to adjourn. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
Bye.
Okay, thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Katrina, so much.